Gardening and language. There are loads of gardening terms that exist to make our lives easier. It means there's no confusion. We know what we're all talking about. But when you're a new gardener, a lot of that language can put you off. It can feel like you're being excluded because you don't know the jargon. So let's go through some of the real, common and basic terms and explain what it means. So by the end of this video, you won't be excluded anymore. You'll pretty much be an expert. Let's start with 3 simple terms for your plants then, and that is annual. So an annual plant is a plant that takes 12 months to go through its life cycle. So that is when it germinates from seed, grows into a little plant, eventually flowers, blooms, and those pass and it produces its seed. Then it'll die. That's the end of its life cycle. So if it takes 12 months to do that, that's an annual. Makes sense. Now we also have biannuals, and it's exactly the same thing, but these plants take 2 years or 24 months to go through that cycle. Quite commonly, those plants put on their root systems and stabilise in that first year and get themselves settled, and then it's the second year before you'll get flowers from that biannual plant. Think of foxgloves as a good example. Now the last one is perennial. Those ones are the reliable little plants. They generally will last more than 2 years, and you know that they're going to be reliable and come back and give you blooms every year. One for the veggie growers amongst you then, bolting. Here's the fun thing about bolting. Bolting essentially means the plant is trying to flower, which, if you're not a veggie grower, is a good thing. It's what you want. But when it's your veggies, you want to avoid that, because if a plant bolts, it can in some cases change the flavour of the vegetable. For some lettuces, for instance, it makes them go really bitter. Something like an onion, if it bolts, if it puts its energy into making a flower, it stops producing that bulb that we all know of as an onion. So you don't want that. It's usually caused by stress, so things like not enough watering and sudden heat, that kind of thing. One to look out for. Cotyledon. This is one of the divisive ones. Cotyledon then is the first little leaves that germinate from the seed. Now, you can get technical and you have dicotyledon and monocotyledon. Basically, some plants have 2, some plants have 1. But cotyledon, commonly called baby leaves. Now, after this, you'll hear the term true leaves, and that generally just means the first set of leaves that appear after the cotyledon leaves. So there you go. It's a common one you'll hear. Not everyone understands it. Pinching out. Pinching out is something I do with my dahlias. All it means is you use your thumb and forefinger to pinch the growing tips out of plants. Now, generally, you're doing this because you want to encourage the plant to put its energy into lots of little side shoots to make it a bushier plant. I do it with my dahlias to encourage lots more growth, so lots more flowers. You also do it with plants like tomatoes, which leads me on to the next thing. Suckers and side shoots. A sucker technically then is when you get a little spurt of growth from the roots of a plant, and you'll get a whole new plant from that. But you'll often hear suckers referred to with tomatoes, and the aforementioned pinching out the suckers. Technically, those little suckers on a tomato plant aren't truly suckers, they're side shoots because they grow out of the stem. So, suckers, side shoots, pinching out. Aerobic and anaerobic. Generally, you'll hear this when you're talking about compost. 2 ways to make compost. One is aerobic, which means it involves the bacteria that like oxygen. The other way is anaerobic, so it's the bacteria that don't like oxygen. It's kind of good to know these 2 terms because if, like me, you're using aerobic composting methods, you don't want it to go anaerobic because that's usually when it gets a bit smelly and slimy. But if you're doing something like bokashi, it's the opposite. It's an anaerobic method. So you do want those anaerobic bacteria in there. Now, speaking of compost, mulch. Mulch then ties into compost nicely because mulch is a thick layer, usually of organic matter, that you put on top of your soil. So it can be, quite commonly, a thick layer of compost, or it could be leaf mould, it could be manure, or even straw. If you grow strawberries, you know the practice of putting straw down. It can be inorganic as well. I've got lots of horticultural grit on my rockery and around some of my beds out front. It has the same purpose. It suppresses the weeds and it keeps a nice layer on top to help reduce the moisture that evaporates. And that ties in nicely humus. Humus is essentially the organic matter in your soil. So if you're a composter like me, you'll know about this term because that's what you're creating is lots of rich humus. It's all the organic stuff that's broken down, like your decayed leaves and your rotted down manure. Generally, it's what comes from your compost. Acclimatisation, or hardening off. That's the process of putting little plants outdoors for short periods of time to get them used to being outdoors. It's usually something we do if we've grown on in, say, a greenhouse or in the house. It's all about getting the plants used to the sunlight and the temperatures, the wind and the general conditions in your garden. We usually do over a period of maybe a week or two, a little bit at a time, and gradually building the plants up until they can be out there all the time, just to give them the best start in life. Another two I'm asked about a lot then is companion planting and intercropping. And basically it's like this. Companion planting, that's when you'll plant plants together for a specific purpose, like marigolds, because the scent of them is quite strong and it will deter some pests. Or even the old one of planting basil with your tomatoes. Again, it's for those strong scents that can deter pests. You also have something called a trap crop, which again is companion planting. But it's when you plant something specifically to attract those pests so they'll leave your other crops alone. Now, intercropping is very similar but has a different purpose. So intercropping then is when you can plant smaller, quick growing crops in between your taller, slow growing varieties and making use of the space you've got. Pricking out then, something I have just finished with all my little onions, and it is essentially just pricking or digging out the little seedlings from the soil so that you can move them on into a bigger pot. And that is called potting on, when you take them out and put them in a bigger pot. Two definitions in one. And of course, we've also got transplanting, or planting out. And that's when you take all those little seedlings you've been growing on and they're now baby plants, and it's time to plant them out into your garden. So there you go, your quick guide around all the gardening jargon you might hear and just how simple it actually is. Question is, are there any favourites you have that I've missed? Feel free to shove them in the comments. See you folks.